So last week we began taking the steps to develop our apologetic for theism. However, we realize that, especially within our postmodern culture, we have to be careful not to take certain presumptions for granted. There was a time, historically, when most people did take it for granted that there is a truth and you can know it. These days, however, people are quick to assert that there is no truth, or we could never know if there is. Or they assert there is truth, your truth and my truth. So truth is personal and privatized, especially when it comes to religious truth. These are just things of kind of like personalized private opinions in order to make your life as meaningful as it can be for you. So we saw that the first thing we really have to deal with is relativism, and related to this, the problem of pluralism. In the philosophical sense regarding philosophy of religion, this was the idea that each worldview can have their own truth, and what's true for them is true for them. So it's kind of relativism extended to philosophy of religion, and this may be because there is no ultimate truth, or it may be the belief that there is an ultimate truth, God, but that any sincere path of wanting to be spiritual can get you to the same goal. So there's not really any need to stress one pathway as better or more correct than the other. You go up your path of the mountain, I'll go up mine, we'll get to the same place at the top. Or, you've got the tail, I've got the ear, but we're all describing the same elephant. And finally, we consider the obstacle that some faced of a presuppositional naturalistic bias. That is, if you have already presupposed that miracles are not possible, then what reason would you have for thinking you might find one? Thus, we spent time developing a sort of pre-apologetic for theism before launching into the apologetic for God's existence. Briefly, our argument was this: the truth about reality is knowable, and we know this from the fact that we cannot communicate without assuming the laws of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle. There are other assumptions that show up, such as the law of causality as well. Second, it is not the case that all religious worldviews can be true, for they claim very contrary things. There may be some similarities, and we would expect this, really. But it's the differences that matter, and there are some big differences. So it is possible that all religions are false, but it cannot be the case that all religions are true, for they claim very contrary things. And only those that are able to correspond to or make sense of reality should warrant our time and attention. To paraphrase C.S. Lewis, we said, some religions make such extraordinary claims that they must either be of no importance or of infinite importance. But given the sort of claims they are, they absolutely cannot be only moderately important. Finally, we dealt with presuppositional issues. We said that theists ought to avoid arguing in a circle from Scripture. So too, non-theists must check their presuppositional biases. We distinguish between possibility and plausibility, between what is possible and what is probable, and between possible explanations and the most reasonable conclusions. We analyzed David Hume's claim that miracles by definition can never be probable, and we saw that this was a category error. By definition, if they were probable, they would not be miracles. They would be naturals. We also clarified that laws of nature do not have to be violated in order to be temporarily suspended. Nature only regulates the system without intervention. Where there is intervention, laws pause. Having clarified that the question is not of probability per se, but rather logical possibility, we concluded that miracles are logically possible if there is a God. So it is not irrational or illogical or unreasonable to believe in miracles if we have reason to believe a miracle has taken place. We also considered that miracles might not be contrary to nature after all. Rather, they seem contrary to what we know about nature. That was the argument from before the evidence, or from logical possibility. It is logically possible that a miracle could occur. We also considered an argument after the evidence. If we've already given the arguments for the existence of God, then we could argue that if God exists, then miracles by definition are possible. And some theists will quickly point out that the greatest miracle has already happened. There was a point in which there was nothing, and then there was something. And if it's possible for God to bring into existence something from nothing, then it is certainly possible for him to do what he wants with that something he has created. Arguments from evidence may also include appeals to near-death experiences, those that include empirically verifiable observations, not simply the subjective reports. Arguments from prophecy or history, and in the case of Christianity, arguments for the resurrection of Jesus. We concluded with a very succinct primer on the basic theistic apologetic arguments and an overview of how one might go from arguing about truth all the way to arguing from Scripture. Very briefly, this was 1. Truth is knowable, arguing for that. 2. Opposites cannot both be true. So this view is either true or false when compared to contrasting claims on truth. 3. The monotheistic God exists, and this is what we're going to be arguing for this week. Having shown that, if we've already done that work, then 4. If God exists, miracles are possible. We could argue before the fact from miracles, or argue for God's existence, and then, by definition, miracles are possible. 5. Miracles can be used to confirm a message from God. 6. Scripture X is historically reliable, internally consistent in doctrine. It carries the mark of seemingly divine inspiration, and its teachings cohere with what we know of reality and what we know from experience. And 7. Scripture X says Y about God. So this week we dig into the heart of theistic apologetics, and we will consider a cumulative case argument. That is when I'm bringing various arguments together rather than just giving you one. An argument is strengthened when it has multiple legs upon which to stand. So we are looking at the cumulative case for believing in God's existence. After that, we will then look at another question that comes up a lot, and that is the nature of the relationship between science and faith. Is the belief in God antithetical to science? Well, we don't have time to waste, so let's jump right in and start by considering the nature of evidence. What counts as satisfactory evidence? If you don't agree here, then you're not going to make much progress. So the question is belief in God rational or reasonable? And the other side of that is, would it be unreasonable or irrational not to believe in God if there's satisfactory evidence? So again, what is the satisfactory evidence? One distinction worth pointing out is that if we lack certainty on any given issue, this is not the same as knowing for a fact that the opposite conclusion must be the case. So if we lack certainty as to the existence of God, this does not mean that we have certainty that God does not exist. It's quite hard to play the hard agnostic. How do you know what can't be known? It is easy to prove that some things don't exist, such as square circles, freezing fire, someone who is both aged 10 and 20, because these are logical contradictions. It's much harder to prove that something doesn't exist when that thing is not a logical contradiction. Another misstep that needs addressing is the claim that there is no evidence for God. Is that true? Many would say yes. In fact, it's not. So don't confuse evidence with your conclusion, or maybe your idea about enough evidence. Given the evidence that's presented, it's fair to say that's not enough evidence to compel me to believe. But to say that there is no evidence is simply not true. Theists give many evidences. It's up to the non-theists to decide whether those are good enough. So agnostics and atheists will have to work to show why the theists' evidences are not good, but they cannot simply say that they are non-existent. But here's another question to ponder. Even if it is the case that the evidence is not good enough in my eyes, can I be justified in believing, based on this, that there is no God? If I say I see no elephant in the room, I'm probably justified in this belief, because in this case evidence comes from seeing with my eyes. But if I say that I don't see an ant in the room, I'm not necessarily justified in this statement. Just because I don't see it does not mean that it's not there. The difference here involves expectation. If there is an elephant in the room, we would expect to see it. And if there is an ant in the room, we would not expect to see it. But the point is that it's not always true that just because there is no evidence presented before us, that the thing in question is not there. So what about God? If God exists, should we expect to have more evidence for his existence than we do have? Consider the case for Santa. If Santa exists, we would expect to find factories in the North Pole, flying reindeer, presents all over the world that were not given by acquaintances to the children. Of course, Santa and all of these things are material things, so that won't work. Well, let's consider floating pink elephants that are invisible and immaterial. These things do not leave traces of evidence, so can we say that we do not know if they exist? The problem, of course, is that an immaterial, invisible elephant seems to be nonsensical. Elephants have to be material and have weight and size, or else they would not be elephants. This, by the way, is why the attempt to criticize theism by arguing for a flying spaghetti monster is really just a bad line of argumentation. Okay, well, what about just immaterial, invisible things? Should we just say, I don't know? Invisible things seem possible. We don't have evidence against their existence. So we have to check our biases when it comes to presupposing that no evidence means that a thing is not there. So what we are looking for within any argument for the existence of God is an inference to the best explanation. Given the facts, as presented in the argument, what would be the most reasonable conclusion? And when we build a cumulative case for theism, we are using different types of arguments, as we will go through today, in order to bring us to similar conclusions that the most reasonable and satisfactory inference is God's existence. Until the time of Einstein, atheists assumed that the universe was eternal. If general relativity was true, however, this could not be the case. Einstein called this an irritating discovery. So even some of the evidences that we may believe we have against theism may lie in question, given more information. And from a scientific perspective, we need to always bear that in mind, that science is not done exploring and seeking new answers even to old questions. So let's dive into the arguments for theism, beginning with arguments from causation. Arguments from causation are based upon a common assumption about the material world, based upon our experiences and observations within the material world. And this is the assumption that from nothing, nothing comes. Ex nihilo nihil fit. Nothing comes from nothing. That makes sense, right? If you agree with this, then the next argument asks, is it more reasonable to believe that we came from something or nothing? Cosmological arguments are concerned with the origin of the cosmos, the beginning of the universe. The cosmological argument basically states that everything that has a beginning has a cause. This is the law of causality, and it is the basis of science. Things do not happen without a cause. Second, the universe had a beginning, and this is based on scientific observations. I'll go into what we call surge in just a moment. So everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. Now this is a valid argument. It follows. So you either have to question premise 1, which is going to raise a lot of problems for science, or you have to press into premise 2. What are the scientific observations or reasons for actually thinking that the universe had a beginning rather than being eternal? And you could argue from many points here, but the most common argument appeals to the acronym SURGE. S refers to the second law of thermodynamics. The universe is running out of energy. This is called entropy. The first law of thermodynamics states that the total amount of energy in the universe is constant. This means that if the universe is eternal, the energy would have run out by now. It has not, therefore there must have been a beginning. The U refers to universe expanding. Hubble observed that space is expanding from a single point. Thus, there was a beginning, a point from which space expanded. R refers to radiation from the Big Bang. Penzias and Wilson discovered cosmic background radiation in 1965. This proved that the universe is not in an eternal steady state. Now, I'm just giving you the simplified overview. If you want a source that goes more thoroughly into this, you might look at I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. G stands for Great Galaxy Seeds. In 1992, COBE, the Cosmic Background Explorer satellite, discovered ripples in the temperature of the cosmic background radiation. The ripples indicate that matter congregated by gravitational attraction to form galaxies. The infrared pictures from COBE show this matter from the early universe. This is why George Smoot called it the seeds of the galaxies. Next is Einstein's theory of general relativity. General relativity states that time, space, and matter are independent. In other words, they came to be at the same time. Perhaps this is why Robert Jastrow, founder of NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies, stated that the astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of the origin of the world. Now, there was a time when atheists pushed back against the Big Bang theory. Some atheists proposed a cosmic rebound theory, suggesting that the universe has been expanding and contracting forever. Of course, there is no evidence for this, and it does not explain how things got started. Stephen Hawking proposed a theory of imaginary time, attempting to explain how the universe might not have a beginning. But this too has no supporting evidence. It's pure conjecture, based on perhaps a wishful thinking. So despite pushback from many non-theists, the most reasonable conclusion seems to be that the cosmological argument is true. The universe had a beginning. And if this is the case, it must have a beginner. A Big Bang, which is evidence for, not against theism, needs a Big Banger. The most famous version of the cosmological argument was developed in medieval Islamic thought and expounded upon and popularized by contemporary philosopher, who's also a popular name in Christian apologetics, William Lane Craig. While other cosmological arguments focus solely on the nature of cause, this effect must have been caused from that was an effect from something else. It must have been caused. That thing must have been caused, on and on and on. And the argument, for example, Thomas Aquinas' argument is that this cannot go on and on for infinity. There must be some first thing, a first cause. The Kalam really digs away at issues concerning the nature of time and infinity and how understanding those problems necessarily leads us to that cosmological conclusion. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. And so this argument presses into that beginning. This means it's situated in time, and that is a significant detail. An infinite can have no beginning, and something that never begins can have no series end. Today is the end day in a preceding series. Therefore, there were not an infinite number of days before today. Therefore, the universe began to exist. This brings us to the conclusion. The universe had a cause, and we call this cause God.
60-second adventures in thought. Number 4. Hilbert's Infinite Hotel. A grand hotel with an infinite number of rooms, and an infinite number of guests in those rooms. That was the idea of German mathematician David Hilbert, friend of Albert Einstein and enemy of chambermaids the world over. To challenge our ideas about infinity, he asked what happens if someone new comes along looking for a place to stay. Hilbert's answer is to make each guest shift along one room. The guest in room 1 moves to room 2 and so on. So the new guest would have a space in room 1, and the guest book would have an infinite number of complaints. But what about when a coach containing an infinite number of new guests pulls up? Surely he can't accommodate all of them. Hilbert frees up an infinite number of rooms by asking the guests to move to the room number which is double their current one, leaving the infinitely many odd numbers free. Easy for the guest in room 1, not so easy for the man in room 8,600,597. Hilbert's paradox has fascinated mathematicians, physicists and philosophers, even theologians. And they all agree you should get down early for breakfast.
Okay, but wait a minute. Hold on. Everything that exists has to have a beginning. You're saying that God exists, thus God also had to have a beginning. So who made God? Check. Well, the law of causality does not say that everything needs a cause. It only says that those things that came to be need a cause. God did not come to be, therefore God has no cause, no beginning. The argument never stated that everything has a cause. It stated that everything that has a beginning has a cause. So from logic and the evidence, we come to the conclusion that whatever caused the universe to exist must be self-existent. It cannot be a caused thing, or else we have an infinite chain of causation and regress. God is caused by supergod, and supergod is caused by supergod level 2, and so on. Since the nature of time, insofar as we are able to understand it, is tethered to the material realm, we see growth and change, beginnings and ends. A self-existent being is not bound by such an understanding of time. So in that sense, God is timeless. So too, space is an aspect of the material realm. So this being is non-spatial. It is immaterial by definition. If matter was created by the being, then the being itself was not created in the moment of creation. So prior to matter was non-matter. The sort of being that could bring into existence the universe as we know it must be powerful. And given the nature of the universe as we know it, this being must also be quite intelligent. That is, it is a rational being, or a person. In the words of Norman Geisler, if there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing? So let's pause here for a deeper analysis of this argument exclusively from causation. An explanation answers the question why or shows the reason for something. We usually like to find explanations of things. A cause is something which makes something else happen. Some things are necessary. They must be. Like 2 plus 2 must be 4. Other things aren't necessary. People aren't necessary. Trees, rocks, stars. So here's our argument. 1. Everything that exists has an explanation of why it exists, and this is either A, because it must exist, or B, because something else caused it to exist. 2. The universe exists. 3. So the universe has an explanation of why it exists. 4. The universe doesn't have to exist. 5. So something else caused the universe to exist. 6. If something else made the universe, it must be God, a being that is not of the universe and powerful enough to bring the universe into existence. Thus, 7. God exists. So we have 7 steps here. Is step 1 true? That everything that exists has an explanation why, and this is either because it must exist or something else caused it. Yes, that's true. Look around. Doesn't it seem that everything must have an explanation? This is part of our common experience. If you found a snow globe in the forest, wouldn't you expect it to have come from somewhere? Step 2, the universe exists. Is this true? Well, that's of course. This is a properly basic belief. We are justified in believing what we see before us until we have good reason to believe that we are in the matrix or only dreaming. Step 3, the universe has an explanation of why it exists. Is this true? Well, yes, it follows from steps 1 and 2. Step 4, the universe doesn't have to exist. Is this true? Yes. Why think that the universe must exist? Step 5, so something else caused the universe to exist. Is this true? Well, it seems to follow from steps 1, 3, and 4. Step 6, if something else made the universe exist, it is God. Is this true? Well, we have to think about this. Let's call this something G. What can we say about G? Does G need an explanation? Maybe G had a cause. We could call that G2. But then G2 needs a cause. This cannot go on forever. If we accept infinite regress, then nothing will ever really get explained. Consider the example of borrowing money. If person A is owed $100 by person B, and they need that money now, but before B can pay A, B has to go get the money, $100 that is due them from person C. Before person C can pay person B, C has to go to D and retrieve the $100 owed to them. And suppose this goes on ad infinitum. We get to Z, but before Z can pay Y, Z has to get the $100 owed to them by person A1. And we do this over and over again. Will person A ever receive their money? No. So infinite regress is not satisfactory. We have to stop somewhere. And Occam's razor tells us to always go with the simpler explanation. So G does not have a cause. G must exist of necessity. So there does exist a thing, G. Nothing made G, and G is very powerful. But this is not enough for many people to see that G is actually God, a personal being. It is necessary for many to show that the cause is actually a person. So we have to ponder further. Now, the only things with which we are familiar that are both immaterial and able to cause things are souls or spirits or minds. These are all the same thing. These certainly seem possible. We are familiar with this idea, but we understand souls or spirits or minds to be persons. We use those words to identify the idea of a rational being, a person. Only minds can intend things. We've no reason to think that there exist impersonal, uncaused, immaterial things, nor that impersonal, immaterial things cause anything. Though it is a debatable area of philosophy, we are, however, familiar with the idea of a mind causing things. Now, we might also ponder why a being such as G would cause the universe to exist. And there seem to be only 4 answers. A, there's no reason. Just did it. That's it. But this is a bad answer. Remember, don't we always expect explanations? We would never accept this answer for other things in life. B, we could also answer that something else made G do it. Okay, we'll call that G2. But why did G2 make G do it? G3? And we're back to the infinity problem. So this answer is not satisfactory. C, there's the possible answer that G had to do it. We already know that G must or has to exist, so if G had to make the universe, then the universe has to exist. But step 4 in our initial argument that the universe doesn't have to exist says that this is false. Also, why would G have to do it? Is G being forced to do it by G2? Are we heading back to the problem of regress? The fourth option is that G chose to do it. And this is the most satisfying answer. Why? Because free choice explains itself. You don't really have to explain why you choose to eat ice cream. But if G is a free agent and chooses, then G must be a person. G must also be pretty smart to cause all the complicated things within the universe. This sort of personal, powerful, and knowledgeable being is what we mean when we say God. Thus, step 6, that if something else made the universe exist, it must be God, seems true. And this brings us to the conclusion that God exists. Now let's dig deeper into analysis of the Kalam's argument against actual infinity. The universe is all of matter, energy, space, and time. It includes stars, planets, mountains, trees, people, animal, dust, radiation, etc. A cause is something that makes something else happen. Think about the concept of time. Does yesterday exist? No. When you finish the exam, you say, "I'm glad that's over." So things in the past are gone. The past experience does not exist anymore. Does the future, tomorrow for example, exist? Does next Halloween exist? No, not yet, but it will exist. The only time that actually exists is now, today, in this moment. So past, present, and future, these things are not equally real. So the argument is, 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. So the universe has a cause. This cause is God. Is step 1 true? Yes, it is more likely true than false that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Isn't this obvious from experience? If you hear a loud bang, don't you wonder what caused it? If it happens in the cafeteria or on the road that you're driving down, won't you possibly turn to see? If a tiger suddenly appeared in front of you and started to chase you, of course you would probably be running, you might be thinking later, but at some point wouldn't you wonder where it came from? How it got there? Something had to cause the tiger to suddenly materialize, right? Would you really believe that the tiger just appeared for no reason at all? That's worse than magic. At least when a magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat, you already had the magician and the hat. Is step 2 true? The universe began to exist. Yes, the universe began to exist because time had to have a beginning. Before today, the day before had to come. But the day before that had to come before yesterday. But the day before that had to come first. And so on and so on. If you keep doing this forever without stopping at a beginning, how could you ever get to today? An infinite has no beginning. Something that never begins can have no series end. Yet today is the end day in a series of days before today. Therefore, there were not an infinite number of days before today. That is, time had a beginning. If the universe had a beginning, it must have a beginner. Anything measurable cannot be infinite. Days are measurable things. If today is Monday, I can measure 2 days before, or 7 days before. I can trace days back to history and so on. However, if infinity were really possible, today would never arrive. Also, scientists who study the universe, astronomers, agree that the universe is expanding. So if you go back in time, the universe would get smaller and smaller until there was nothing at all. So the universe began to exist. What about step 3? The premise that the universe has a cause. Well, this follows from steps 1 and 2. And this brings us to the conclusion that the cause of the universe is God. But what caused God? God does not have a cause. God just exists, in the same way that 2 plus 2 just is 4. Look at step 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause, but not everything has a cause. Only those things that begin to exist. God doesn't begin to exist. God does not exist in time or space of necessity. Since this Supreme Being made the universe, the Supreme Being cannot be in the universe until it is made. So, God cannot be made of matter. Thus, God is immaterial. So, in summation, there exists a God. Nothing made God. God never began to exist. God is not in time. God is immaterial. God is not in space. God is very powerful and intelligent. And God is a person. So that was the cosmological line of argumentation for the existence of God. Now let's look at teleological arguments for God's existence.
The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at the bottom, no design, no purpose, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
I don't know, I'm pretty satisfied with the explanation of the evolutionists.
Yes, I do believe we are descended from animals.
Evolution is obvious.
Man was not created in God's image. God was created in man's image in order to address those things about which we were ignorant.
I think part of the grand joke of it all is that, before there was feet, there was flippers. Before there was lungs, there was gills. And, it's all part of that process that got us where we are today, gridlocked and angry.
I sometimes wonder why anybody talks about anything else, because this is the most interesting topic there is. Where did we come from? How did we get here? What brought us into existence? What is our relationship to reality as a whole?
You look at the incredible diversity and complexity of life, and inevitably the question arises, what brought all this into existence? Was it simply chance and necessity, undirected natural forces? Or is there something else going on? Is there a purpose, a plan, a design due to an intelligent cause?
It's really interesting to notice that the more we know about life and the more we know about biology, the more problems Darwinism has and the more design becomes apparent.
We have not the slightest chance of a chemical evolutionary origin for even the simplest of cells.
The discovery of the information-bearing properties of DNA and RNA is a fundamental challenge to all materialistic theories of the origin of life. Neo-Darwinism and its associated theories of chemical evolution and the like will not be able to survive the biology of the information age, the biology of the 21st century.
When I look at the evidence objectively, without ruling out the possibility of design, design just leaps up as the most likely explanation. And that's why I believe that it's true.
We can't explain these systems by natural law. And if we're searching for truth, and they are in fact designed, if we have to be design engineers to understand them, then I say, what's the problem? You go where the data leads you. And the implications, yeah, they have profound metaphysical implications, but so be it.
For several centuries, we've been told that the universe does not have us in mind. That is, that we exist in a small speck of dust in a very large universe, and that the universe was not designed for beings like us. Our argument suggests something completely different. It suggests that the universe was intended, that the universe exists for a purpose.
The laws of physics are balanced on a razor's edge for life to occur. What you have is a universe that is not only finely tuned for life to occur, but also has a beautiful, elegant mathematical structure, and a structure such that we can discover that structure.
There's something about the universe that can't be simply explained just by the impersonal forces of nature and atoms colliding with atoms. And so you have to reach for something beyond the universe to try to account for it.
The founders of modern science, like Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo and Newton himself, believed that the universe was the product of a mind, that it was intelligible to beings like ourselves because the universe itself was the product of an intelligent being.
I was trained in journalism and law to respond to truth. I had to take a step of faith in the same direction that evidence is flowing. You don't have to commit intellectual suicide to come to the conclusion that there is an intelligent designer. Because today, science is pointing more directly and more powerfully toward a creator than any other time in the history of the world.
The teleological argument, or the argument from design, argues that every design has a designer. The universe and life have a highly complex design. Therefore, the universe and life have a highly complex designer. Now, this is not a deductive proof. Premise 2 did not state the universe was designed. That would be a deductive proof. If the argument was every design has a designer, the universe was designed, then it would naturally follow that the universe does have a designer. However, premise 2 is not a deductive given. And so the theist is avoiding a God of the gaps claim. This is not a sort of, well, it seems like there's design, so stick God in there. God did it. Not that sort of thing. Rather, it's a significant inductive argument, an argument from probability. This is an inference to the best possible explanation. What best accounts for what we see? Is it the case that the universe seems to be designed or not? Does it bear marks of intelligence or not? And if so, what is the most likely or the best possible explanation for this? In the biblical literature, King David, famous for his battle with the giant Goliath, wrote, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, they use no words, no sound is heard from them, yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world." David is making an informal appeal to this argument from design, that you just look at the way the world is, and it's not that you're plugging God in where ignorance lies, but rather, quite the opposite of ignorance, you see that there is such a striking craftsmanship, intelligence, beauty, meaningfulness, and purpose everywhere you look. And what better explanation is there for an intention than an intender, for beauty or craftsmanship than an artist, for purpose and design than a purposer or designer? So its premises are based upon observation, as is the nature of science, and so its premises are more debatable than those of the argument from causation or the cosmological argument. Still, interestingly, and maybe because it has that scientific nature to it, it is the teleological argument that seems to be more successful in appealing to atheists than other arguments. Yet appealing to science as it does, it understandably causes a point of tension between those who hold to theories of macroevolution, not microevolution, and those who advance various theories on creation. So for the sake of repetition, the argument from design says if every design has a designer and the universe and life seem to have a highly complex design, then the most likely explanation would seem to be that the complexity of the universe requires a complexly intelligent designer. William Paley put forth one of the most famous formulations of this idea. Suppose you were walking through the woods and you stumbled across a watch. If you found a watch in the woods, would you think it was made according to the laws of nature? Or would it be more likely that you would infer that something about this thing requires intricate thought and design? It has gears. It has pieces that have to move together. It's the sort of thing that seems to require forethought and purpose. That is, it seems to be the sort of thing that is intended by a mind. Now, stop and think for a moment. What is science? Well, science is, in the words of Francis Bacon, a search for cause. So our driving question is, what caused the universe? Now, there are two types of causes, natural causes and non-natural causes. And non-natural causes are causes that are created, caused by some other being. The Grand Canyon is an example of a natural cause, whereas Mount Rushmore is an example of a non-natural or a created cause. So the question is, what caused life? What caused the universe? Intelligence or non-intelligence? Now, the theist has many resources into which they may press here. They have many avenues for argumentation and evidentiary support. Recall what we said already. While it may be the case that one finds the evidence offered for theism unsatisfactory, it is not the case that there is no evidence for theism. And when it comes to the teleological argument, there is much evidence to be pondered. Now, science presupposes the principle of uniformity, that causes in the past are like those in the present and those of the future, and this argument really presses into the anthropic principle, the idea that the universe is slightly tweaked to support life on Earth. Consider the following arguments that have been raised by theists and scientists. Oxygen comprises 21% of the atmosphere. If it were 25%, fires would break out. If it were 15%, we would suffocate. If the 23-degree axial tilt of the Earth were altered slightly, Earth's surface temperatures would be too extreme. If the gravitational pull were altered 1 in 10 to the 40th, the sun would not exist and the moon would fly off into space. If the centrifugal force didn't balance the gravitational forces, nothing would be held in orbit around the sun. If Jupiter were not in its current orbit, in which it functions as a sort of vacuum cleaner, we would be bombarded with space material. The rotation of the Earth, giving us 24-hour days, is so exact that if this were to change and it rotated too fast, the wind velocity would become too great, and if it rotated too slow, it would become too hot or cold on Earth. So within the general argument from design are more specified evidences for fine-tuning. And the most popular and powerful of these fine-tuning arguments and evidences appeal to what are called the cosmological constants.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant, If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be life prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. What is the best explanation for this astounding phenomenon? There are 3 live options. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these options is the most plausible? According to this alternative, the universe must be life-permitting. The precise values of these constants and quantities could not be otherwise. But is this plausible? Is a life-prohibiting universe impossible? Far from it. It's not only possible, it's far more likely than a life-permitting universe. The constants and quantities are not determined by the laws of nature. There's no reason or evidence to suggest that fine-tuning is necessary. How about chance? Did we just get really, 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 really lucky? No. The probabilities involved are so ridiculously remote as to put the fine-tuning well beyond the reach of chance. So, in an effort to keep this option alive, some have gone beyond empirical science and opted for a more speculative approach, known as the multiverse. They imagine a universe generator that cranks out such a vast number of universes that, odds are, life-permitting universes will eventually pop out. However, there's no scientific evidence for the existence of this multiverse. It cannot be detected, observed, measured, or proved. And the universe generator itself would require an enormous amount of fine-tuning. Furthermore, small patches of order are far more probable than big ones. So the most probable observable universe would be a small one, inhabited by a single, simple observer. But what we actually observe is the very thing that we should least expect: a vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe, inhabited by billions of other observers. So even if the multiverse existed, which is a moot point, it wouldn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. Given the implausibility of physical necessity or chance, the best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge.
So one thing you may have noticed that makes this argument pretty powerful is its accessibility. It can be approached from a rigorous scientific level or even a poetic level, as demonstrated by the Psalm of David. And this is because it's accessible to both the scholar and the layperson. The layperson sees the world's grandeur at face value, and the one who studies the world sees its intricacy. And sometimes the two approaches coalesce in a powerful way, as demonstrated by this pop song from the 1990s contemporary Christian artist Carmen.
93 million miles from the blistering surface of the sun hangs the planet Earth, a rotating sphere perfectly suspended in the center of the universe. The ultimate creation from an infinite mind. An unbelievably intricate, complex design, a supernatural testimony, and an irrefutable sign that there is a God. The size, position, and angle of the Earth is a scientific phenomenon to see. A few degrees closer to the sun, we'd disintegrate. A few degrees further, we'd freeze. The axis of the Earth is tilted at a perfect 23-degree angle. It's no mistake that it is. This allows equal global distribution to the rays of the sun, making it possible for the food chain to exist. Or take, for example, the combination of nitrogen and oxygen in the atmosphere we breathe every day. It just happens to be the exact mix that life needs to prosper. It doesn't happen on any other planet that way. You see, the Bible says the invisible things of God are clearly seen through his creation. To believe this is not hard. If there's a design, there's a designer. If there's a plan, there's a planner. And if there's a miracle, there is a God. The scripture says the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. If we allow our minds to drink in all the truth that just surrounds us, creation itself will help us understand. Did you know the moon controls the tides? It's the maid that cleans the oceans. Even the waves don't crash the shores in vain. The tides drag impurities into the depths of the sea. It's nature's constant recycling chain. It simply boggles the mind to think that the stars will rotate with such exact precision that it's true that the atomic clock with an error factor of less than 3 seconds per millennium is set by the way they move. Though they silently orbit, the sun, the moon, the stars are like celestial evangelists above, who circle the earth every 24 hours, shouting in every language that there is a God.
If you're interested in these things, there's also a lot of food for thought from the area of mathematics when it comes to proportional coincidences. One of my favorite things to ponder is the Fibonacci sequence. This involves the sequence of numbers that you find when you begin with 0 and 1 and you add the last two numbers. So 0 and 1 is 1, 1 and 1 is 2, 2 and 1 is 3, 3 and 2 is 5, then you have 8, 13, 21, and so on. And what's really cool is you'll find that sequence throughout nature. If you square these numbers and place those squares next to one another, you find what is called the golden rectangle, as it exemplifies the golden ratio. And as you continue to construct these rectangles, you find a perfect spiral. And what's really amazing is that you can find this spiral or some application or inversion of this ratio throughout nature. And it was so striking and strikingly connected to perfection that artists and architects throughout history have tried to imitate such perfect proportions. So the question is this a coincidence? Or does the fact that we find this sequence so many places throughout nature mean that it would actually take a leap of faith to believe that it was just a coincidence? Even composers like Bach have locked on to the significance of the Fibonacci and used it in their compositions. But as a musician myself, I've always been far more interested in the fact that the sequence shows up in the musical instrument. For example, if you look at a piano and you see the divisions on a piano between white keys and black keys, create a sequence of black keys where you have a set of 2 and then a set of 3, a set of 2 and 3, and so on. Well, this is the 2-to-3 ratio, and it creates the pentatonic, or the 5-note scale. In the pentatonic scale, the next note would be the octave, or 8. So you've created a ratio of 2 to 3 to 5 to 8. These are Fibonacci numbers. Major and minor scales use 7 notes plus the return of the first note at a higher interval. This is called the octave, so major and minor scales have 8 notes total. But the major and minor scales leave out some notes. So if you look at all possible notes within the octave, you find a 12-note or chromatic scale. Now what's interesting is if you layer these, you find the Fibonacci ratios falling on the most consonant or pleasing sounds within the scale, and outlining the most consonant or stable sounding chord, the tonic chord, or the 1 chord. This happens to be the chord that the music always pivots from and to which it wants to return. So again, is this a greater evidence for coincidence or intelligence? You'll have to decide that for yourself. The teleological question reminds me of the Baroque style of music composition. Today, when people compose piano music in an art style, they usually give you very explicitly every note that you're supposed to play. In the Baroque, however, it was not like this. Rather, all that you would get is the bass line and sometimes some cymbals beneath the bass line. And from this, the musician would infer the information that they were supposed to provide above the bass line. The Baroque musician was expected to play the full range of their keyboard, yet all they were given was the bass. So too, all we are given from the observation of our world is the fact that nature seems to be imbued with proportional coincidences, an amazing sense of structure and order, and even some very peculiar fine-tuning specifications. The question is, are we meant to realize and infer intelligence, or is it all just happenstance and coincidence? Again, what requires the greater leap of faith? You'll have to decide. Now, we are not done with the teleological argument, but we are out of time. So we will pick up next time with what is called the intelligent design movement, and we will ponder the alleged divide between science and religion. That is, whether theism is actually antithetical or complementary to science. We will clarify a popular misconception as to what creationism does and does not mean, and we will briefly consider the challenge to Darwinian macroevolution. After this, we will continue to survey other arguments in the cumulative case for theism, including Thomas Aquinas' 5 arguments, the ontological argument, and the moral argument.